right, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning. No, there is no time, so whatever it is, good time to you. So if you want to come closer, this is going to be a wonderful opportunity to have a discussion. And just know that this is, I guess, being recorded. And so if you don't want your name to be known, don't say your name. But I was hoping to have time after the keynote presentation this morning to just address any questions that come up. And so let's begin with any questions. I'm Dan Siegel, if you had a question about that. If you're in the wrong room, please go to a different room. And there are seats up here if you want to come up closer. I think there, or maybe, is that available? Oh, they're taking the seats. Okay. And if there are no questions, then I'll just come up, I'll talk more. So whatever you want to do. Yes, question in the back. Here comes a microphone. Let's hear it for our volunteers who are helping and our staff. Thank you, thank you.
Dr. Siegel, great to meet you. Thank you for your great insights this morning. We
Absolutely,
have a new film
thank
out
you.
called The Endless Question, based on a new theory.
Hold it right up like an ice cream cone. Yeah.
Okay. Based on quantum field psychology. The idea being that the mind is an energy field which transcends the physical brain. Wondering how you might apply it to your work. I think it coincides in many ways.
So what I do is I work with quantum physicists,
Right.
And directly to talk about what do we know about quantum physics. So I'm not, I'm aware of at the Evolution of Psychotherapy conference, for example, this year, we have 8,000 people that come every few years, and there were a number of talks on quantum relationships to the mind. And for me, it was very painful because the things that were said in the name of quantum physics had nothing to do, at least what my quantum physics colleague would say is what quantum physics says. So I'm not aware of what some of those theories are about. So what I'll talk about is what we know from the field of physics that then studies microstates and what we know from that. So that I can speak to because that's who I work with. In that world, we have a number of really interesting things. And if you look at the Scientific American cover story in July 2018, you'll see this really interesting, very short article. It's just 6 pages long about how can quantum physicists study when what's called the quantum realm becomes the Newtonian or classical physics realm. So I don't know if this gets to your question because I'm not familiar with the specific thing you're talking about, but just in terms of in general, how we in the field of understanding consciousness or anything related to the mind, for example, can reach out to the field of physics. So in the field I work in, interpersonal neurobiology, our stance since the early 90s has been, what if you took every field of science and combined it into one framework? And people asked me to name it, so I just came up with a name that I would change today if I could, but we now have 70 textbooks I've edited in the field, so they won't let me change the name. But the name is Interpersonal Neurobiology. And I would change the name because it doesn't really get at it, but back in those days when it was starting, I chose interpersonal because it was about the inter, what's happening in the between, and the personal, what's happening with the within. And so that was really helpful. And everyone was like, it was the decade of the brain beginning. Everyone was so into neurobiology. I just put that on there. So in interpersonal neurobiology, we basically draw on math, physics, chemistry, biology, including neuroscience, of course, and genetics and medicine, and then psychology, linguistics, sociology, and anthropology, and all sorts of other academic disciplines. And we say, what if those are like the blind man and the elephant, and they're all picking one aspect of reality? Could we have a whole elephant view of reality, even though universities don't support that? And later on, E.O. Wilson would write a book called Consilience, which talked about how universities don't really promote cross-disciplinary thinking. They don't even really promote intradisciplinary thinking so well. There's a lot of competition and political and economic things. That's a really beautiful book if you've never read it, called Consilience. But these Consilience findings suggest, and this I think is what your question is about, is how do we draw on fields like quantum physics. So I've had a lot of people tell me not to do this. I've had psychologists tell me not to do this. Neuroscientists get very agitated because they say, well, the mind is just the activity of the brain. And that was said by Hippocrates 2,500 years ago. And William James reaffirmed this 125 years ago. And so you have this kind of implicit belief. So if you say something like what I said in 92 to try to get these anthropologists and neuroscientists in the room and everyone else in the room to agree, 40 scientists in the room, what could be the thing that's within and between? How could an anthropologist be correct? The mind happens between us, or I'm an attachment researcher. We study the mind in the relationship between a parent and a child. But a neuroscientist might also be right. How could they all be right? Because they don't agree with each other and they don't give each other much respect. So what happened from there was the notion that, energy is passing through the brain and energy is passing through the whole body. And right now is right? What just changed? I wasn't passing airwaves past my vocal cords, and airwaves moving is sound energy. So on one level, energy is what our relationships are all about. So energy is the between and energy is in the within. And over the last 25 years and more, actually, I've always had groups of interns work with me to revise, this textbook I wrote, The Developing Mind, which first proposed this in the 90s. And I always say to them, I want you to find one piece of evidence that says these ideas are wrong. And they go, you mean right, don't you? I said, no, I mean wrong. They go, what? I said, you got to find one piece of data, one research approach, one paper, anything that shows it's wrong. So in those years, we haven't found anyone in science who's talking about mind as an emergent property of energy in science. Of course, there's energy psychology and stuff like that, but in terms of a scientific field, it just doesn't happen. So that just was really interesting. So even though we haven't found it, they can't find anything to go against it. Now, once you do that, then you ask the question we asked in the presentation this morning, which is like, what is energy? And then you get into the whole idea of quantum physics, where quantum physics is studying not what Newton studied 350 years ago, which is how large objects interact with each other as nouns or entities, but quantum physics is about studying the quanta, or basic unit of energy, which is a probability field. An electron or a photon is a probability field. It's a wave. And so when you look at what's been discovered over the last almost 100 years, you find that the properties and principles and laws, the equations that are incredibly accurate to the trillionth place, they can predict things in quantum physics. It's probably the most predictive theory that we have. Doesn't mean it's complete and no one really understands it. And it's so weird, people think, how could it be true? But that's why I put a quote in the Aware book, from a quantum physicist saying, just because something is weird doesn't make it a criteria for getting rid of it. In fact, one quantum physicist said to the other, the question isn't whether your ideas are weird. They're definitely weird. The question is, are they weird enough to be true? And so one of the weird ideas is that you have two realms. So someone doing the Wheel of Awareness who lives near Sir Isaac Newton's house, she had me go to England, and we did the Wheel of Awareness around the apple tree, where Sir Isaac Newton figured out gravity, a macro state, obviously now Newtonian law, of large objects. And when you drop from the rim of the wheel into the hub, I think what you're doing is you're transitioning in your subjective experience from Newtonian classical realm, where things are nouns interacting with each other like thoughts and emotions and memories, that rim stuff, which ultimately is plateaus and peaks, and you're coming down into the plane of possibility, that hub of the wheel, which is, I think, a quantum state. And it's probably why, as you heard, people say, I felt time disappear, I felt connected to everything, because in the quantum realm, things are not entities, they are events. In other words, things are verbs, not nouns. And the verbs are massively interconnected events that are unfolding. Whereas in these large bodies we're born into, we have this experience which is real. It's not that it's not real. Macro states are real, right? So you have the classical, what's called Newtonian. Classical and Newtonian are just synonyms. The classical Newtonian macro state world of noun-like things rather than the quantum experience of the verb-like interaction. So when I learned about that this quantum physics view from these physicists is that energy is the movement from possibility to actuality, the whole thing just became clear. So I don't know if that addresses your question, but I know there are other questions, but that just gives you the view. And what I want to do as an interpersonal neurobiology person is to really respect the hard work of science and try to always point out controversies. So one of the controversies that comes up a lot, people will say, quantum physics has shown consciousness creates reality. And that's just not true. Quantum physics has not shown that. Quantum physics makes the controversial proposal that observation collapses the probability function. In other words, an electron acting like a wave, when you turn a camera on and look at it, it acts like a particle. But nobody says that camera created the electron. It may shape the electron's probability state. That's a controversial point, and it may be true. So why people go from shape to create is a fascinating psychological issue. As a psychiatrist, I just find it fascinating that someone thinks that if there are 500 people in this room, that 500 consciousnesses are going to somehow converge on the same reality with this cup of water now going down my throat. Thank you for aligning your no, I mean, it doesn't do it like that. But people will say that. People at this conference have said that. And I'm always, and I say to them, I said, show me the data. How can that be? You got 500 consciousness. I mean, so that's always interesting. So, but I just want to be clear. In quantum physics, it's called the orthodox Copenhagen interpretation of the double-slit experiment that questions why turning a camera on makes a wave into a particle. No one knows why. It could be that observation changes the probability state, and that would be awesome. It's probably what I think that's, if that's true, that's why awareness changes your mental experience. Yeah. Please.
So happy to see you.
Nice to see you.
Of the folks who are big luminaries in the field, you seem to have some of the broadest exposure and in all of your books to psychotherapy. And I was wondering if a psychotherapist had the pleasure of 5 minutes with you and you were to share your most important gleanings, what would they be?
Well, I always am trying to write a short book, so that's a good challenge of 5 minutes. I wrote a book called The Mindful Therapist, if you're talking about therapy, which was exactly with that sentiment in mind. And, so there's actually that book and the Mindsight book and the Pocket Guide book. And, those are all 3 books that would take you longer than 5 minutes to read it. But, ultimately, I feel as a mental health practitioner that if you recognize mind is much more than the brain. And this really gets a lot of academics very upset. So I have to, part of the reason why you'll see me be so conservative about synthesizing the different sciences together is because it really angers the people in the individual field. And so I want to honor what they do and draw on them with a really conservative view of what they're saying, but then look for the consilience. So in our annual meeting, if you come to our annual meeting in April, you'll see an incredible attempt to bring a diversity of scientists from all over the place, as well as practitioners and our leading mindfulness folks and wild shaman folks who are working with native indigenous peoples here in North America, all sorts of people, because I think the conversation has got to bring science and spirituality together, honoring rigorously those spiritual traditions and rigorously those science traditions. So when you put mental health into that mix, it comes down to, I think, something super simple. The mind, beyond subjective experience, which is super important, and awareness or consciousness and information processing, is this self-organizing process. Once you define the mind in that fourth facet way, then you can say what a healthy mind is. So a healthy mind, I would say to this 5-minute therapist hanging out with me for 5 minutes, I would say, so no, because there are a lot of other questions, but I would say that a mind that creates integration within and between, the locations of the mind is within and between, with the body as a reference point, that's what a healthy mind is. And if you look at, when I work at climate change things, and we're going to do a lot of climate change work in April, believe me, the name of our conference is Timeless Wisdom, Timely Action, and so, so you want to, as a therapist, you want to help people realize that the mind is within the body and it's in your connection to other people on the planet. So when the planet is in trouble, as we heard so powerfully from Paul Stamets today, and using his mind to have these epiphanies of how to actually work with bees and to work with mycelium and to probably, and if he doesn't get a Nobel Prize, I don't know who should, right? To allow that mind of his to drop into an awareness to how new combinations realize, oh my God, the bear claw, all the stuff he told us about. So a mind that creates integration within and between is health. Health is this faces flow of harmony, chaos, and rigidity explain every form of suffering in any system you want to look at. So if you're looking at individually working with therapy or a couple or a family, that's fine. But we have a responsibility to Earth. Earth is our extended body, and we are just extensions of the same thing. So that one of the talks at our conference is about Pando populus, and Pando is the name of the quaking aspen tree. And in Utah, we went on a pilgrimage, 50 religious leaders and me, because I'm not trained in religion, but anyway, people think I'm spiritual. So I feel that's a deep compliment. So I'm with these folks, and we go to this place where there's 4,700 trunks of an aspen tree, and you go 6 inches beneath the surface, and you've discovered it's one root ball, and you do the DNA test, and every one of those 4,700 trunks are the same tree. And I think that's all these bodies in this room is the same thing. We are one differentiated set of extensions from, if you want to call it source, that's fine, but I'd like to use the word we, me plus we equals we. So an integrated identity is where you realize, I do have a body. I want to care for my body, exercise my body, enjoy my body, feed my body, sleep my body. All those things is a me. It's like the wax of a candle. But if you think you're just the wax, you're going to lead a very sad, isolated, meaningless, non-spiritual, if you want to use spiritual for meaning and connected, non-spiritual life. And that's not healthy for anybody. You need to realize you are the flame beyond the wax alone. And then your job is just to light up other candles. And when you light some other candles up, it takes nothing away from your wick. So that's an integrated way of living. And I think the whole field of mental health needs to shift its focus from disorder, which it doesn't really define anyway, it's basically chaos and rigidity, to health. And health is integration. And when you realize it's within and between, then we all have a responsibility, not for our own individual lives, but for our interpersonal lives and our connection to the whole planet. Yeah, can we get a female? And somehow it's all men, which I love men, but it's I also want to make sure we're doing a distribution. I don't know why that's happening like this. Go ahead, Don, go ahead. And I should also say to everyone, but yes. I'm just noticing it.
So my question was about the Enneagram book that you're coming out with. You've been doing research with David Daniels, the Stanford MD that worked with it for so long. Can you give us a little capsule? Because they were looking for some scientific evidence, and apparently you guys came into some. Or can you give us a capsule of what's going to be in that book and what your observations around it are?
Sure. I'm happy to. I had the good honor of working with David Daniels, whose body passed just a little while ago. So David's not here in this forum at this moment. But his daughter, Denise Daniels, who just emailed me about half an hour ago, Denise and I, Laura Baker and Jack Killen, we're working with David. The five of us were working together, and we're all scientists, inspired by the exploration that's been going on since the late 60s, early 70s, called the Enneagram. But in our view, there's a much deeper process arising of how the mind develops. So we're actually not going to use the word Enneagram because we feel it's actually limiting our understanding. And there's a certain, just for all of you know, there's a certain approach called the Enneagram that has a certain nomenclature. David wrote a book on the Enneagram, all that kind of stuff. So what we, inspired by the narratives of the field that Helen Palmer and David Daniels worked on called Enneagram and the Narrative Tradition, where they interviewed thousands and thousands of people, and they allowed me to go as a scientist to interview people too. What we've been doing over the last 10 years is developing a framework for understanding how the human nervous system, which in part is related to the human mind, it tends to have certain proclivities that are inspired by a person from Washington State University in Spokane, Jaak Panksepp. And Jaak, who was a colleague of mine, wrote 2 books in our series. And those books invite you to consider the subcortical structures that are involved. This is very controversial these days, so I want to honor the controversy. But Jaak's view was so powerful that there are bodily processes and brainstem and limbic processes that are deeply shaping of our emotional experience. And for those of you who know, there's a big fight going on now among the scientists that's really, really painful to watch because, anyway, it's not very pleasant. So I don't want to get into all that. But I just want to honor that there is a controversy about what I'm about to say. So from that view, we do inherit a tendency, for example, to have 3 major kinds of distressful states you can get into. And I write in The Mindful Therapist, there's a whole chapter that my colleagues and I put together that, with their permission, I put it out. So it's published like in 2010. So it's been out for a while. The Mindful Therapist, the chapter on traits, has this entire thing I'm going to summarize. So we put it out there a long time ago. So what we've been working on basically is the idea that you have anger, sadness, and fear. And when you're in the womb, you're at one with the uterus, and you're hanging there, and then you get this really weird thing called birth. And if you think about the difference in your mental state, the subjective experience you have, and probably the awareness you have of just you don't have to breathe, you don't have to eat, you don't have to pay your rent, you don't have to go to work, you don't have to read the news and see what's happening in politics. I mean, none of that stuff. You're just being, right? You're just resting in being. It's this ground of being, right? And then you come out, however smooth or not smooth it is, you're now out here in the air world, and it is really different. Like, it is a bad joke, right? Because now you get hungry, you've got to eat, you get cold, you get hot, you got to depend on others for your survival, you're scared, all these things that happen. So we think, and now we've done this with thousands of people, and we could do it in the room if you want, we think people, for probably temperament reasons, meaning genetic proclivities or just random things that happen in the nervous system, people, like about 90% of people we've surveyed, fall into one of those 3 categories. Another like 5% of those, the 10 that don't go into one of those 3, fall into 2, and some have all 3. So it's just interesting. And so we believe that there's a way in which your temperament is arising from this disparity between the in-uterine environment and the extra-uterine life. We call it being versus doing. And in the doing world, you tend to go to either anger, sadness, or fear. At least 90% of us seem to do that. And then you have a focus of your attention, which tends to be either internal, external, or both. And then that divides into 9. And then you have people who like to be either in their inner life or one-on-one or with a social thing. So that's another 3. So that's 27. So now you have these patterns based on probably how the default mode network of the brain develops. So if you blend the subcortical circuits that Jaak so powerfully wrote about, and basically books you'll see written that say emotion is completely constructed and has nothing to do with the brain's innate features. If you read those books, you'll see they say, we're totally ignoring the subcortical structures. It's like, well, why would anyone ignore the body and the brainstem and the limbic area when talking about emotions? It actually makes no sense, but that's what the big fight is about, basically. That emotion is only cortical, which it's a very cortical thing to say. Anyway, so I don't want to get into that. But the bottom line is, sure, you have these subcortical things pushing on your temperament. Then as you develop, you have your default mode, which is from the medial prefrontal cortex as one node back to the posterior cingulate cortex, and then other areas are involved as well. And so if you take the default mode development along with these subcortical proclivities, you get 27 different things. So the book we're writing basically lays out the 27 things and how, if you really understand the brain, basically if you do the wheel of awareness, to get to, Don, what you're asking about, if you do the wheel of awareness and think about the hub as the plane, then those plateaus would be a way to graph out in a 3P framework your particular one of the 27, so that the place you come in life would be a plateau shaped by those factors. I said the focus of attention, the default mode, and the subcortical propensities. And then you would have a plateau that's like that. So when you can do the wheel of awareness and drop into the plane, you're basically dropping beneath those plateaus and seeing, oh, isn't that amusing? I want to do this or do that or do that. And it liberates you. And so we did this at Esalen. We had 150 people. We filled up the campus. We had one of the people was terrified of her particular temperament, whatever. And we just did this exercise where in front of everyone, she just dropped into the hub, out of this rim stuff, or dropping into the plane. And she could just say, oh, I don't have to do that. And we go, right. Yeah. And she goes, cool. And it was like she had been stricken with panic and all this kind of stuff. So that's kind of how to put what we talked about earlier with that model. Does that make sense? And it's fun because, it liberates you from there's a lot of things written about temperament, but in our view anyway, this is a way to really get into it from a how do you grow through it kind of thing. We don't have a name. We're busy talking about the name. Do you have a good name for us? We do have a name. But it's not going to fly. I know it's not going to fly because it's just some joke of ours. It's called the PDP model of personality. And PDP is a joke because it's a mathematical term for parallel distributed processing, but it's also our acronym for, patterns of developmental pathways. So we love it. The publisher has this ultimate thing to say about titles. So that's why I say we know what the name is, but, so maybe it'll be PDP, but it'll be just search for our names. It'll be Laura Baker, Denise Daniels, Jack Killen, David Daniels, he'll be one of the authors, and me. So it'll be a 5-authored book. Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. I'm also a psychotherapist, and
Yay.
Loved your books very much.
Thank you.
And also love the Enneagram, use it a lot. But I was really influenced by a book once that was written by a channeled, and it was called...
Written by who?
A channel named Ra, and it was called The Law of One. I don't know if any of you all know that one. But what was really amazing about that book to me was that the central theory was that there is only one, and that therefore you are as influential with one person as you are with a million people. That there's a way that there's a center core that in being and in presence. And so for me in my own work, I'm so focused on the presence of the heart and the heart bridge. And what I find when I come here is that even though everybody's aware of unity on one level or another, that's what brings us to the Nonduality conference, is that there's there's this resonance of deepening and grounding in with the heart. And then there's also this way in which our collective anxiety about world events and the place where we are now just seems to flutter us up here, and there becomes this running motif of, but what are we going to do about it?
Yeah.
What are we going to do about it? And it just occurs to me when you mentioned the trees and the big root ball at the bottom.
Yeah.
How much really articulating the difference between being and doing and being in a radiant way.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. I just to build on that, I think it's really powerful. And last night, or I guess it was night. No, it was the afternoon, I think, or sometime anyway. What time doesn't exist? So there was a moment where this happened. It was Kabir and Hamid and Robert talking about this stuff, and the question came up, and I asked that question that came up. It builds on exactly what you're saying. And I said, well, what are we supposed to do with how things are? What's your suggestion from the spiritual folk on this panel and the scientists on the panel? So one way you can think about it is this. We have, he was talking about rats doing this. So we have, hundreds of millions of years of evolution that seem to be making us look for who's similar to us and who's not similar to us. We have 50 million years, that's mammalian history. Then we have 50 million years of primate history where we do in-group, out-group distinctions with our primate brain. And we basically destroy those that are in the out-group. Then we have whatever you want to call human history. Some people say it's 4.5 million. Some people say it's 200,000, whatever it is. This relatively shorter time of human history where we've perfected the art of being full of ourselves, basically. Where you say it's this is my in-group and you're in the out-group. And when you do brain studies, the circuits of empathy and compassion, which we know exactly how those are mediated in the brain. So you put it in a person's brain scanner, you can shut them off like that. When the person says that person I'm seeing is in the out group, and basically what you do is you dehumanize them. So I think one thing we can do from the field of mental health and the field of education and the field of just being humans on the planet has everything to do with what you're saying. How do we comport ourselves one-on-one with being present, for sure, from the heart like that? But even more, I think what we need to realize is that we do have this reality. We're born into a body. This body has this terrible, terrible history of violence and genocide. And while we're incredibly capable of feeling at one and all that stuff, we can actually destroy millions and millions of people. We can destroy millions of animals and plants. So I think the next step of human cultural evolution needs to be at the level of consciousness and identity. It has to be where we allow people to drop out of those plateaus of in-group, out-group distinction and give them access to that plane of possibility as a formal technique. Just like we teach people to brush their teeth so their teeth don't rot, we've got to teach people to drop into that plane so the planet doesn't rot, because human beings are destroying life on Earth, right? And so then, yes, it comes to one-on-one, but even more than that, when I work with schools or when I'm working with governments or when I'm working with, organizations, this is how I talk to them. I said, the next stage in what we have to do as a humanity is to actually go beyond what is our propensity, which is this in-group, out-group thing. And then the good news is it's win-win-win. We'll realize the peace of that plane. We'll realize the interconnection of the plane. And we do it one by one, exactly like you're saying. But you can also reach to people who are in charge of organizations and governments and talk to them about how they've got to do this. And have to is, I'm not saying that in a mild way. We have to do this. It has to be, we use the human capacity for consciousness to rise above our vulnerabilities as a species. Yeah. Yes. I don't think that's on. Here we go. Try it again.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Tatiana. I'm a mathematician and transpersonal psychologist.
Beautiful.
And my question is about the talk you gave in plenary, and especially in a place where you said that this is hypothesis about the field of possibilities.
No. That the mind's awareness arises. Right. That's the hypothesis.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the hypothesis. So the question is, do you agree that description is not the reality? So, and there is always a gap between the description and the real phenomena.
Of course.
Of course. So in this case, it could not be true or false. It's just a way of talking about that. Just one way.
No, you can have a way of labeling with linguistic symbols, like saying, this is the plane of possibility, and this is the formless source of all form. So those are words. So when you say descriptions, absolutely, that's a description. It's based on, mathematical thinking, as you know, and a quantum physics view, that the nature of reality is based on quantum properties that propose a quantum vacuum. So then what you do as a scientist is you say, well, let's do some studies to see if this description using words and, mathematical equations is accurate, and we do this and this, then this will be the outcome. And then sure enough, you do that, and it's not the outcome. You say, well, then it's probably a wrong description. Or you say, oh my gosh, it was accurate to the trillionth power. Let's try it again. Accurate to the trillionth power. Let's try it 20,000 times, and you can predict. And then you say your description is accurate. So that's how you proceed in science. You use concepts and categories that we test and we try to prove are wrong. And as we do that, then we can say, you've established a huge amount of empirical support for, let's take what Paul Stamets talked about this morning. He was able to get an idea. It was a description with words and an image. He then tested that idea with the bees, and then bam, he's probably going to save the world. That's a truth. Yes. So no, that's in the quantum world. What the stuff I was talking about was quantum equations. Well, I think if you look at what quantum physics studies is the distribution of probabilities, and it's not the classical world. I would take a look at that 6-page article, When the Quantum World Meets the Classical World, and then you'll see how they're working out. It's full of equations, and as a mathematician, you'll probably appreciate it. So it isn't just that anything's possible. There seem to be laws that govern the universe. Yeah. Thank you so much, everybody.